Hello, global gardeners. Happy Monday. Are you ready to start your gardening week with some gardening chat and gardening community? It's always so nice to have everybody together on our Mondays and talk gardening. Now, I know some people actually say that their gardening week might start on a Saturday or a Sunday, but for me, I like to delineate it as Monday, the week ahead, because by the time I get to Saturday and Sunday, I'm usually overworked and I want to try to take it easy. So I still use my weekends as time off, even though a lot of that time is spent in the garden. Nice to have everybody here. Mike is always one of the first ones to sign in. Great to have Rick, who's staying up so late to be with us, and everyone else from so many places all over the world. It's great. And today, I'd like to focus on things I don't often talk about, and that's wrong information or incorrect information or information that may not be exactly what you're looking for. I recently joined a Facebook group for a local gardening information source. And the idea is that it's a bunch of gardeners from my city, and they get to Facebook and they post pictures of what they're doing, a lot of questions being asked. And I noticed that a lot of the responses, a lot of the answers to a problem were wrong. Were the kind of things that were a waste of time. And the single one that really stood out to me was a gardener had posted a picture of her tomato plants saying, "What's wrong with my tomato plants? I'm watering. I think I'm doing everything right, but the leaves are yellowing." And when I looked at the picture, I saw big, green, healthy plants. The bottom leaves were turning yellow, and it was just a few of the plants that had the lowest leaves turning yellow. And so I responded, after having read some of the other comments, with, "That looks perfectly normal. Tomato plants, most plants will develop yellow leaves at the base of the plant as they're growing. They're shaded out by the sun, and so the photosynthesis decreases, and the response of the plant is to put more energy into new growth that is at the top of the plant, getting lots of sun, and those lower leaves will turn yellow and fall off." Now, I didn't say all of that in my comment, but the point was, it's normal for leaves to fall off plants after turning yellow. Look at the top of the plant to see what the new growth is. If it's green and healthy, then everything is okay. But the response that really stood out to me was from a gardener that said, "Next year, bury an egg in the hole and you shouldn't have that problem." And that is just so incorrect on so many levels. I've done some videos on myths and some videos on information you should question. And burying an egg in the hole absolutely does nothing for tomato plants to the positive. What it can do, especially if you crack it, and that was kind of implied in the comment that this other gardener was making, you now have a rotten egg in your soil. And that smell is enough to attract raccoons, dogs, cats. And so by burying a broken egg in your garden bed with the idea that it's going to help your tomato plants, you may end up getting your tomato plants dug up by an animal that is trying to get to that egg, an animal that could care less about your tomato plants, but an animal that thinks a smelly egg is something that needs to be explored. And so that got me thinking a lot more about information. And I read more of the comments for questions that had been asked on this particular group and saw that while these gardeners were trying to be helpful and were presenting information they thought was good, in actuality, for an experienced gardener, for a master gardener, for someone who's been doing it as long as I have and have done the research, I was able to easily recognize that this information was not the way to go. So that's why I wanted to talk about it today. Now, I know many, most, maybe even all of you from watching my videos and all the other YouTube videos and participating in our weekly chats are more knowledgeable than the average gardener. But there are many things that we as a group do just because some other gardener told us to do it. And that's really the underlying message of today's show is be careful about some of that information you receive. Now, I regularly say, particularly for new gardeners and for gardeners moving into a new area, is to get to know local gardeners, get to know the gardeners in your community, and have them tell you what works and what plants to grow. But this was really kind of an eye opener for me to recognize that just because a gardener is a gardener doesn't mean that they necessarily know the best ways to garden. And so if you rely on their information, sometimes you're wasting time. So I'm looking for your tips that you've heard or things that you've done that you're unsure of, and then we'll go from there and see if it is something that is a good tip to pass on to somebody or if it's something that you really need to question more. And Lily Valmont says, I enjoy these old wives' tales about gardening for some reason. And so do I. I actually do enjoy listening to them or reading them because it brings a smile to me, because it's like, oh, that's wrong. That's something that they're obviously doing and they heard from somebody else, and there's a trail to that information. That's the old wives' tales, go back generations in some cases. And so they just keep being perpetuated and continue to be done. And maybe it's because nothing bad has happened. Now, I've said this periodically. One of my basic philosophies is that a good garden grows where a good gardener goes. And so if you're taking the time to ask a question and then taking the time to bury an egg underneath your tomato plants, then you're probably also taking the time to amend your soil, to water your plants, to mulch your plants, to protect your plants. And so when your tomato plants do great, it's easy to say, well, it's because I put an egg in the soil, obviously. Well, no, I think the reason your plants do great is because you're out there every day, because you're taking care of the plants. And the egg just happens to be a coincidence. And so many tips we have in our garden are just coincidental, that everything else you're doing is right. And that's why the plant is performing, or that's why the pest is not attacking, or whatever the problem happens to be, is because you're in your garden taking action. It's not because of all those miscellaneous things that you've heard you should do. Shannon is saying, I tried the egg trick with 2 of my tomato plants, literally did nothing. Joke's on me. I don't necessarily think of it as a joke. I think that's an important lesson. And thank you for sharing that, Shannon. Thank you for putting yourself out there for us, because that is often a way to determine that it doesn't work. It's when you try to figure out why your plants are doing so well and you say, oh, it's because of the eggs. No, it's because of everything else. It's important to recognize a little bit about soil biology, how it works, all those organisms and the plants, and how everything works together, to then break it down to those individual tips that we're doing. And so we all know that plants need nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and a lot of other macronutrients and a lot of other micronutrients. And so it makes sense. The one of the biggest problems tomatoes have is blossom end rot, which is caused by a calcium deficiency. So you see a lot of tips for tomatoes that are based on eggs or egg shells, because we all know that eggshells are made from calcium. So the line of reasoning is eggshells are made from calcium. Tomatoes need calcium, so we'll bury eggshells in the garden, or in this case, the whole egg in the garden. Well, the type of calcium that plants use is already in your soil, and the type of calcium that forms eggshells is not the same type of calcium. So just because there's a nutrient that we are familiar with does not necessarily mean it's the exact nutrient that the plants need. Nitrogen is an ideal example of this. We say plants need nitrogen. But if you were to put nitrogen in its pure elemental state in the soil, plants can't use it. The nitrogen actually needs to be converted into nitrates or ammonium. Ammonium is nitrogen. And so the nitrates and the ammonium, two different ways that nitrogen can be broken down by the biology in the soil. That's the type of nitrogen that plants use. So when you look at the label on a bag or a bottle of nitrogen, you will often see that the nitrogen is identified in a nitrate form or as ammonium, because that's the way that plants use it. The same with potassium. We know that bananas have potassium. Well, when we eat a banana, the microbes in our body need to break down the potassium in a banana into a form that our body can actually use. It's the same in the garden. The potassium needs to be in a form that the roots can take up for the plants. And so you'll see berry banana peels in your garden to introduce the potassium. Well, first off, most of the potassium in a banana is in the banana that you're eating. It's not in the skin of the banana peelings. And then secondly, it's not in a form that the plants can use. So you can bury all the banana peels you want, and you're really not introducing any potassium that's going to be beneficial for the plants. So when you start looking at the science, understanding the science, you can get away from these old wives' tales and these tips that seem to make sense because of how they work in our body or how we think they might work in the soil, but that may not necessarily be the case. And so Lawrence is saying bacteria turn ammonia into nitrite, and others turn nitrite into nitrate, which is the stable form that the plants can use. Exactly. And so it's critical. I talk so much about soil and adding organic matter to soil and trying to get a big population of those microbes in your soil. That's why. It's because they're the ones doing the work that are converting all of these elemental nutrients into forms that the plants can use. So the idea that we can just throw something in the soil and it's going to make a big difference is where we run into problems. And it's helpful, but it's one of those things that it may or may not actually work. Serena's saying, how much aspirin and water do you blend to water micro determinate or indeterminate tomato plants? So I don't use water, or I don't use aspirin. And aspirin, there have been some recent studies that show that aspirin does have some impact if you need it. My tomatoes do great in my soil, so I have no need to add fertilizers. I have no need to use a compost tea on the leaves. I have no need to introduce aspirin to it. So when you ask how much I use, I don't use any, because I'm focused on the soil. I'm focused on getting the soil to the point that it is providing everything that the plants need. You'll often see this with Epsom salts. Epsom salts are something that we should add to our soil to improve it. So it's magnesium sulfate. And so magnesium and sulfur are things that plants need to grow. But magnesium and sulfur are commonly occurring in our soils. So we don't need to add more. And if you add the Epsom salts, now the Epsom salts need to be broken down by all those soil microbes into a stage that the plants can use. And most of our soils don't need it. So unless you do a soil test and you see that you have a deficiency in magnesium or sulfur, you're just wasting your time by putting Epsom salts in your garden. And you can actually create a problem. Too much magnesium in your soil in a readily available form for plants actually can block out some of the other nutrients that plants need more of. And so that's a big issue we have with some of these tips is we can potentially be creating a different problem when we're trying to solve a problem that really wasn't a problem to start with if we had just taken the time to get a soil test or taken the time to recognize that a good amended soil may not need any of those kind of things. And that's one of those things that it takes time for us to learn. Now, have I buried eggshells in my garden? Of course I have, because you see so many people talk about burying eggshells. Have I saved and crushed the eggshells for years? Yes, I did that for years. I don't do it anymore because I've since learned that it's really not necessary. Now, I will save eggshells and I will crush my eggshells, but that's for my worms. Worms have a gizzard in their gut, kind of like a chicken. And so chickens need small pebbles, little bits of a hard substance, a grit, so that they can eat whatever it is that you're feeding your chickens, and for them to be able to break it down in their gut. Well, earthworms are the same thing. They have a gizzard, and calcium is one of the things that is actually beneficial for earthworms. And so little bits of eggshells can actually act as a grit in an earthworm's gut, and they can break it down into a form that can actually be beneficial for them. So eggshells in your soil, yeah, it might benefit some earthworms, but that's very, very unlikely. It's just one of those things that do it. Because, like burying the egg, if you're saving eggshells and crushing eggshells and putting them into your soil, then chances are you're also amending with compost. And you're also potentially using aged manures and you're using cover crops. Those all work. Those are all good things. And so I'm not going to say don't or stop burying eggshells because it's wrong. I'm just saying it's unnecessary and it's a wasted step. But if the eggshells are what's taking you out to your garden, then keep doing eggshells, keep burying banana peels, keep doing all of those things if it makes you happy and if it gets you into your garden. Mobius 981 says hilarious about eggshells and tomatoes being wishful thinking. Absolutely. And Bohemian Herbology is saying garden myths to ignore. What a fabulous idea for a topic. Riveting. Thank you. I'm glad you find it riveting. It is. I do find it riveting as well, because when I see some of these things that are recommended, it like I said earlier, it does bring a smile to my face. But sometimes it brings a grimace. So, for instance, if you have a really bad pest problem and you look into some of the corrective actions, insecticidal soap is something that you can get that specifically targets the insect pests that you might have on your plants. And so it is a soap, but it is insecticidal soap. And it's one of those things that you would buy at a nursery, you can buy online, and you use it as directed for the things that are bothering your plants. And it can work, not in all cases, and it can kill some of the beneficial insects that you might want to keep in your garden, but it is effective. Well, the natural line of thinking for people who don't want to buy insecticidal soap is to make their own soap-based insect product. And you see a lot of this where you take dishwashing soap and you mix it with garlic or hot pepper, or there's all kinds of recipes out there. Well, it's important to note that dishwashing soap works differently than insecticidal soap. And so the dishwashing soap has chemicals in it that basically can destroy the cellular surface of a leaf, because the dishwashing soap is designed to break apart oil particles on your plates. It's intended to work with water to basically clear the oils, the food, whatever it is that's on your plate. Well, so when we put that type of soap on our plants, it's doing that to the leaf surface. It's clearing out all those natural plant oils, and you can end up killing your plants, at least severely damaging them, if you put dishwashing soap on your plants. A lot of people do it. A lot of people find out the hard way. A lot of people might look at a pest problem. They use the homemade soap. It destroys their leaves, and that convinces them that they should have acted sooner, that it was the insects that destroyed the leaves, not their action. It was the insects. And so then they double down and put more of their homemade soap on, which could lead to disaster. So there are a lot of things like that that, again, makes sense. The line of reasoning seems valid, which is why so many people do these actions that are mythical. But it could be because they're dreaming that maybe it is something that's going to work, and that it's one of those things that they need to keep doing more of to solve the problem. You know, the watering is a key example of that, where your plants wilt, and that's a normal response to high temperatures. And so the transpiration process of plants, the plants will absorb moisture through the roots. That moisture travels up through the plant based on the differences between high and low pressure, even within the size of a plant. And then it goes up to the cells in the leaves, the stomata, which open and close and let that water vapor escape. That's how a plant breathes, and that's how a plant moves water through it. Well, when it gets hot out, the stomata close. Those little cells close up so that the plant doesn't lose water vapor. The result is, because you don't have that water traveling up through the plant to keep it erect, to keep it turgid, then the plant begins to wilt. Normal, perfectly normal for plants to wilt during the heat of the day. Then once it starts cooling down, the stomata open up again, the water travels back up, the plant gets turgid and stands erect, and everything is good. What do people do when they see their plants wilt? They water the plants without necessarily taking that analysis step of what the conditions are. Maybe the plants don't need water. If the soil is perfectly moist, now by adding all of that water, you could actually be creating another problem. Soil needs oxygen for the roots. And when you put too much water in, when you saturate the soil, you're moving out the oxygen from the soil and replacing it with water. And now you're drowning your plant. So that may be a reason why your plants don't do well on hot days, because you're watering during the heat of the day. And I see a lot of suggestions and recommendations for when your plants wilt, be sure you get out there and water more. That's not always the best case. Teenage Gardener is asking, is it true that tomatoes won't ripen in hot weather? We have a heat wave coming in West Virginia, and I have some tomatoes beginning to ripen. Yeah, temperature does affect pollination, and temperature does affect ripening. Now, I've been talking in recent weeks about using shade cloth to help reduce the temperature underneath the shade cloth for the plants around it. And that may be enough. I use shade cloth in the summer over my peppers and over my tomatoes on the really hot days in particular, but I usually just leave them in place for weeks during the hottest time. And right now, this last week, we set 3 record high temperatures in my area. It's been really hot. It's been touching on 100 degrees, about 38 Celsius most days this week. This next week, it's going to cool off much closer to normal, which is going to be great. But the fruit and the flowers that are about to fruit are affected by those high temperatures. You can mitigate that by shading the plants. And actually, even a little extra misting of water. And so, talking about that transpiration process where the water vapor is moving up to the plants, if the air is very dry, that water vapor is lost to the air. And that's usually when that wilting cycle starts. And so if you live in a very dry region, and especially during those really hot days, you can get out during the day, during the afternoon, and mist your plants, create some water vapor around the plants. And that will help mitigate some of that wilting, because there's already water vapor in the air, and it's helping out the plants by kind of replacing some of that water on the leaves. It's another one of those myths that you shouldn't water during the day, that the water is going to burn the leaves. Well, think about all the years that we've been farming and all the years that we've been gardening, the millennia, and it rains during the afternoon. Well, the rain doesn't harm the plants. Why would watering during the same time harm the plants? It doesn't. The only issue, I did a video about this a couple years ago with problems with watering, or the mistakes people make with watering. The biggest issue when you're watering during the middle of the day is that the water can be really hot. I actually measure it in that video and show how hot it can be. So if you water during the afternoon because the soil has dried out and it needs more water, maybe you were away. I'm going to be away for a little bit this weekend, and I'm going to be coming home during the afternoon. And the first thing I'm going to do is go out and water my garden. That's okay. I'm focused on the soil, but when the water first comes out of the hose, I'm watering an area of soil that doesn't have plants directly growing in it. That water will eventually seep throughout the bed and help the whole bed stay moist. But I don't want that super hot water coming out of the hose directed on my plants and causing damage. And then once the water begins to cool, I'll go to my plants and water at the base of my plants to make sure the soil gets nice and moist throughout the bed. Nothing wrong with watering during the day, but a little misting is fine. You can actually see this. There are some. I went to in Phoenix, Arizona. There are desert botanic gardens there, and so there's a lot of places. I saw the same thing in San Diego, California, at the botanic gardens there. They'll have misters, particularly in the greenhouses, to help cool things down for the plants. And part of that could be to help ripen the fruit, to help keep the conditions cool enough that the fruit will ripen. It won't really cause problems when that fruit doesn't ripen. It just stays on the plant longer until the conditions cool down, that it can continue to develop. And that might even happen at night. Plants do a lot of their work at night when things are cool. So I wouldn't worry too much about excessive water on the plants. Wormalist is asking about cedar mulch in vegetable gardens. Go for it. So cedar is one of those things. So eucalyptus, cedar, black walnut, there are a lot of woods that might have some chemical impact on seedlings. But when the wood is used as a mulch, it really isn't an issue. When the wood of a tree dries, it essentially loses those potentially harmful chemicals. And cedar is one of those woods that actually is resistant to rot. That's not going to proceed into the soil. And so the bacteria that actually more fungi that break down wood, takes longer for that to happen in cedar because some of its naturally occurring chemicals. Well, those chemicals aren't going to leach into the soil and destroy the soil life underneath it, which I've heard as a myth. So all of those woods, the black walnut in particular is one that you hear a lot about. And then on the West Coast here of the United States, where there's a lot of eucalyptus trees because of the oils in the eucalyptus, but all fine to use as a mulch once they start drying. Continues. We weren't getting rain, and the amount of conflicting information out there for cedar was nuts, even from the local extension and the nitrogen lockup. So yeah, and you're right. There's conflicting information. Now, when we talk about the nitrogen lockup, so what happens when something that needs to be decomposed by the soil bacteria is in the soil? The bacteria need nitrogen. So they take nitrogen from the soil and nitrogen from whatever the material is that they're breaking down, because the microbes will begin breaking down that material. And then as those microbes die, that nitrogen is now in the bodies of those dead microbes. So when new microbes eat those dead microbes, now the nitrogen is released. And so there's a balance there, and it takes some time. Initially, the nitrogen used by these microbes decomposing the organic matter is taken from the soil. But in time, through these dead bodies, it's released back into the soil. And so what happens when you have like a woody chunk, a wood chip, is it locks up a lot of nitrogen when it's buried, when it's in the soil, and when you've got those billions of microbes that are trying to break it down. When it's on the surface of the soil, there is some of that nitrogen imbalance, but only at the very surface of the soil. And so if you delve into this, you'll see some studies and some research that has shown that there is a minor deficiency in nitrogen at the soil surface when a wood chip mulch is used, but we're talking an eighth of an inch, a millimeter or two into the soil. It does not affect the deeper soil. It doesn't affect the soil of the bed. It only affects where the wood chips are in contact with the soil. And so, first off, don't bury your wood chips. Well, I talk about that in my mulching videos and in my vegetable gardening videos where I show that I'm using straw and grass in particular as a mulch, because that will break down much quicker. Don't use a wood chip mulch and then at the end of the season bury the wood chips, because you can really exacerbate that problem, because it's only happening around the surface of the wood chip. And so when that wood chip's on the surface of the soil, it's only happening at the very surface at the top of the soil. But when you bury that wood chip, it's happening all the way around that wood chip. And if you have a lot of wood chips in the soil, then you have all these little pockets of nitrogen deprivation if you try to grow a plant in there. So yeah, there's a lot of conflicting information, and I love that you guys are here, and I love that you guys are listening to me, but don't blindly trust my information either. Get out there and get that second source of information, or third source, or fourth source of information, because like we just talked about, there can be a lot of conflicting information. But when it comes to eggshells in the garden, go to Epic Gardening and you'll see Kevin talk about the exact same stuff that I talked about. And you go to Simplified Gardening and Tony will talk about the same stuff. When you have the gardeners that you trust, and those of us that tend to have these big YouTube channels, you'll see some consistency. You'll see that most of us are on the same page because we've done that research, because we're trying to use the science behind gardening to make our gardens better. It's gauging the conflicting information. So when Kevin and Tony and I say don't bury eggshells in your garden because it's a waste of time, but then your next door neighbor says, oh yeah, I bury eggshells and they work great. It's up to you to decide which one you're going to listen to. And I would suggest you do that extra step of research to say, oh, Scott and Kevin and Tony are the ones that are right. I shouldn't be listening to my next door neighbor gardener. What else has she told me to do that I need to be concerned about, that I need to do more research? That's really what we need to get to, the point where we can all be making educated decisions in our garden. That's really the way I like to approach it. Wormula says already got an opinion from Ashley from Gardening in Canada as well. Yeah. And Ashley is a soil scientist. She was on the show early last year. I had her on as a guest. And Ashley is a soil scientist, and she approaches it from a scientific perspective. And she actually takes it a step further than I do, and most of the rest of us will do. Is she, because she's a soil scientist, has some videos where she's actually run some scientific tests for some of these things that we're talking about. So yeah, Gardening in Canada, good information that Ashley presents, and that is research-based. I think it's important when we look at information. If we can find research-based information, that's what I tend to default toward. The problem is that there's a lot of information out there that there's no research on, because universities don't make money researching home gardens. So they might research farming, agricultural level, or commercial level agriculture, but they're not in your backyard garden doing things like what's going to work and what's not going to work. Pressure treated wood I'll use as an example, and I'll have a video coming out on this pretty soon. Don't use pressure treated wood in your garden. You hear that all the time. And don't worry about it. Use all the pressure treated wood you want. I actually worked with Oregon State University a few years ago, taking soil samples from my garden, because I have beds that are pressure treated wood and I have beds that are untreated wood, and I have metal beds and I have concrete block beds. And I sent samples from all of my beds, multiple samples, to Oregon State University. They were conducting a study. They had their own test beds that they were taking samples from too. And they released a paper just a few months ago that says pressure treated wood is fine to use in your garden. What leaches from the wood is primarily copper, because that's what pressure treated wood is these days, is a treatment that is copper based. Well, copper is one of those elemental nutrients that plants need. And so while there was a minimal amount of leaching directly around the surface of pressure treated wood, it wasn't enough to cause a problem. It was well within the amounts that plants would normally absorb, and it didn't travel through the bed. So you can listen to me and you can listen to the research that Oregon State University has done, or you can make the decision to not use pressure treated wood. There's no problem with that. It's okay to not use pressure treated wood. It's when I hear people argue how terrible pressure treated wood is with no basis in scientific research. And that's really the gist of this, is do what you are comfortable with doing. If you don't like the idea of pressure treated wood, if you don't like the idea of chemicals of any type in your garden, that's fine. At the Galileo garden, I didn't use pressure treated wood because the entire garden was chemical free, artificial chemical or synthetic chemical free. And so I made a choice with the students not to use pressure treated wood. But in my home garden, I do it all the time. It's not that big a deal. It lasts longer. Wooden beds will break down in time. Pressure treated wood breaks down over a longer period of time. So I think it's a viable option for most gardeners. I'm not going to argue with you about it. I'll just let you know that there's some research out there that says it's okay. And I use that information to my benefit. How we use the information we have is absolutely wonderful. Big Will Dog says, for the most part, all in-ground beds should have plenty of calcium. Absolutely. I've only had issues in my potted plants. I've treated wood in my beds. No issues. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, I think it was, I was on the Urban Gardener live cast yesterday, and we were talking a little bit about this. I think it was Dr. Elaine Ingham. She's the one, if you're familiar with the soil food web, she's done a lot of lectures. She has videos on the soil food web. And I believe it was her that said that all the soil on the planet has enough calcium. There's calcium all around us in all of our soils, enough for the plants. And so the key is that we're talking soil. A mineral-based natural soil has plenty of calcium in it. However, potted plants generally don't have that natural soil in the pots. We use soilless potting mixes. We use potting mixes that are made with cocoa coir or with peat moss and with forest products, which is just ground up trees. and compost, and often some fertilizers that are added to the commercial bags of potting mixes. And so there's no mineral-based soil, which means there's very little calcium, if any, in those potting mixes, unless we add it ourselves. So you are exactly right. In ground beds, you shouldn't have any issues with calcium, but in your potted plants, you're probably going to have to add nutrients in the form of fertilizers to get some of those macronutrients beyond NPK and a lot of those micronutrients that are going to be needed as well. So take that for what it's worth. I see that. Oh, I just missed that comment I wanted to highlight. Let's see if I can find it here in a minute. I just see that Jay is right on top of things talking about Boothby Gardens, and I saw her with a link to Oregon State, but I missed it in the feed. So I'll just go ahead and move on. Maybe I'll come across it again. And there it is. Jay Dixon, along with Heidi, are fantastic moderators. Pressure treated wood for raised bed construction in the Willamette Valley. There's a link from Oregon State University. And like I said, I'll have a video where I'll be talking about it and send some, actually in that video, I'll have video of them actually doing some of that testing. So it's actually pretty fascinating. I think science is fascinating and it really makes a big difference. And Sherry is exactly right. The newer copper treated wood is safer than the older type that had lots of arsenic. And so, yeah, back in the 70s in particular, venturing into the 80s, the pressure treated wood was treated with arsenic. And arsenic is a natural ingredient or element in our soils, most of our soils, and isn't harmful to the plants. It was more of a concern that was harmful to the people cutting the wood and working with that wood. And so the arsenic-based compounds were converted to copper-based compounds. And even those compounds have gone through a few different generations. I think it's copper azole is the primary one used now. Ca is the short form that you'll see sometimes listed on wood. And it's that natural progression of thought that I talked about earlier. Well, pressure treated wood with arsenic was bad for you. Therefore, all pressure treated wood is bad for you. That's kind of the line of reasoning that a lot of gardeners use without doing the research. And if she hasn't already posted it, Jay may post the video I already did a year or so ago talking about the science behind the chemicals that are copper based in the pressure treated wood. I have a video on that. This other video is going to focus more on the Oregon State University findings. Information is out there to use. It's that line of thought that it was bad, so it must still be bad, so I won't do it. And so I'm suggesting that you just be careful about some of that and learn some of the things that take it to the next level. Totally up to you and how you choose to garden. And it's one of those things that I don't like to tell anybody that they're wrong. I'll say it's inaccurate. I'll say it doesn't work, but if you do it, continue doing it. Jen Van Brunt is saying, we had a researcher talk to our local garden forum last year about the complexity of setting up experiments to test home garden topics, even just in looking at shade and wind oriented around buildings. Yeah, every garden is unique. You've heard me say that many times. Every garden is unique. Every gardener's practices are unique. And so to try to do a scientific study in a garden that is going to be transferable to all other gardeners, it's extremely difficult. And the complexities in setting up those experiments really are tough. Now, I've done some experiments and I've made some videos about some of the experiments I've done. And I try to say in the video, I try to stress the idea that it's not a scientific study. I may have a control group and I may show a couple different methods. I did that with the way I grew tomatoes last year, where I set up the tomatoes that I didn't bury deeply, and then two different ways of burying the tomatoes at one point, but not another point. And then a third group of tomatoes that I buried deep into the soil just to see the root development and to see how well the plants did. That's the kind of experiment we gardeners do. And after my research, quote unquote, I found that the tomato plants that weren't buried deeper fruited earlier, grew just as big as everything else. And actually, in my season, that tends to be shorter than a lot of other gardeners, might be the best way to go. I acknowledged in that video that it was not a true scientific experiment. But of course, I got dozens and dozens of comments from more scientifically based people saying that that wasn't good research and that wasn't a good study. Well, yeah, I acknowledge that. It wasn't something I was going to publish a paper on. It was just me doing my own research to see what works best for me in my garden. And I shared it with you, potentially with the idea that you would do your own research, or maybe you would just go ahead and start planting your tomatoes differently and see if it made a difference for you. That's what home gardeners do. Scientists approach it differently, which is why sometimes that research doesn't work in the garden. There's a lot of anecdotal information out there, and I have a ton of anecdotal information to share because there is no research-based information to support it. And even the research-based information will change in time. And so when I became a master gardener 20 years ago, one of the things that was advocated in the Master Gardener program when burying a tree or a shrub was to mix compost into the hole. That's no longer advocated because what has transpired over the last 20 years is some research that showed that when you put the good soil, the compost into the soil in the hole, particularly if you live in a place like mine that has terrible natural soil, the roots are going to stay in the hole. They're going to stay where all that nutrient rich soil is, and they're not going to spread outside of the hole. So now the research based information about planting a tree or a shrub is don't amend the soil. Just take the soil that you dug out of the hole and put back into the hole because that's the life that those roots are going to have in the future. So don't baby them in the beginning because you're actually doing more harm than good. With time, even some things that generations of gardeners have done, the information will be found that there's a better way to do it. And if it can be shown to be research based, that's the best way. If it's one of those things that thousands of gardeners are doing and it seems to work, try it. And it may work for you, but it may not work for the reasons that you think it does. And ultimately, what works is what we try to do in our garden with as much of our effort as we can. TJ the Hawk is saying millennial gardener in a recent video claims that pruning diseased tomato plants is actually a myth and it does more damage to the plant than simply letting it be. Where do you stand on this? So this is one of those things. I saw a presentation that a soil scientist did that said essentially, he just flat out said that healthy plants are not attacked by pests and do not get sick. That healthy plants have natural mechanisms to fight off pests and diseases. The plants that are going to be diseased and the plants that are going to be attacked by pests are not strong. There's something wrong with that plant, which makes them susceptible to the diseases. And so the idea being that if you prune off the leaves and the stems of a diseased plant, it's really not making much difference because the plant is already maybe not strong enough to survive. And so, yeah, I tend to agree with that. many of the diseases, particularly with tomatoes, and I saw that video pop up from the Millennial Gardener, but I didn't watch it. He has too many clickbaity titles to try to make me scared. I don't like to make people scared in the garden, and I don't tend to watch videos that use the fear factor to get me to watch it. But there is some validity to that tomato diseases, once they get into the plant is going to be gone. If it's a particularly harmful disease, if it's a fungal based disease that is spread by spores, when you cut off the diseased leaves and stems, well, the spores are already on the other leaves and stems, so it's just going to continue to spread. If it is a viral disease that is actually inside the plant, then pruning it off is not going to make any difference at all because it's already in the plant. Now, there are some like the powdery mildew, for instance, which really isn't that bad of a disease. It's very common. It's all around us. And at the end of the season, particularly with our squashes or maybe our cucumbers that get the powdery mildew, you can slow the progression of the disease. Once that powdery mildew gets onto a leaf, that leaf is dying. The photosynthesis shuts down. You get that powdery gray coating over the whole leaf, and it's going to drop off the plant. Well, you can go ahead and cut that leaf off as soon as the powdery mildew appears, and the plant's energy is not directed anymore to trying to save that leaf. It continues to be directed to the rest of the plant, to that cucumber, to that squash that needs just a little bit more time to ripen at the end of the season. And the same with a late blight. You might be able to gain a few extra days, a week, maybe more, by pruning off the leaves of late blight for the same reason, just to limit its spread so that the plant can recover a little bit and give you the fruit. It's the end of the season. It's going to be ending its life anyway. But for worse diseases, for psyllium wilt, for tomato spotted virus, those type of things, cutting off a few branches really isn't going to make a difference. And so I mentioned it in a video I did last year when I was talking about that treatment, or about those 3 different ways that I was doing the planting of my tomatoes. And one of the tomato plants nearby that I was growing was obviously diseased. So my approach is don't even deal with it. I don't want disease in my garden at all. And I've been pretty good about keeping it out. So when a diseased tomato plant appears, rather than trying to prune it so that I can control the disease, I think it's often better to just remove the whole plant. So it's lost. It's weak. It's not going to perform, which is why I got the disease in the first place. And so it's better to just take the plant out so that it doesn't infect anything nearby, and that you don't have to waste your effort on it. So that's kind of how I stand on that issue in a roundabout way, talking about a number of different aspects of the diseases in tomato plants. And what I found out was I had a more serious disease with the tomato plant that I took out. And so I'm glad I took it out, because no other tomato plants in that big bed were affected, and everything else did fine. But you see this a lot with blight, and I know that the UK had a big problem with blight last year. Hope it's not going to be as bad a problem this year. But blight is one of those things that just spreads from plant to plant to plant. And if you can catch it early, you might be able to arrest some of its development. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you just kind of have to accept that it's going to happen. Nachi G is saying, I plant my native shrubs and plants without amendment and try to mix the potting planting soil that the plant comes with the soil from the hole, so no waste. Yeah, and that's kind of what I do. I will use the soil from the pot just so I disturb the roots at a minimum level. But my roses I've posted some pictures on my Gardener Scott Instagram with my new roses that have already started flowering. That's what I did with my roses, and they're doing great. My soil is terrible. I did amend that whole area. So it wasn't just the soil in the hole, it was the whole area that had amended soil. But when I dug the hole for those roses, I just dug a hole and put the potted, actually, they were bare root roses. I did a video about that. They were bare root roses. And then I just replaced that same soil I took out of the hole back around those bare root plants. They just took off. They're doing great with absolutely no concern about putting compost into the hole. Sherry says, I'm reminded of my son's pediatrician advising I let him play with the dog, get dirty outside, and occasionally eat dirt. He developed a robust immune system and we had no childhood diseases. Yeah, that's, and there are some studies that support that our protected environments that some of us are raising our kids in are not exposing them to naturally occurring pathogens that most of the time are not harmful. But if you get exposed to them and if they are harmful, you develop an immunity and it's no problem later in life. So I don't encourage my kids or grandkids necessarily to eat dirt. I have heard that as a suggestion, but absolutely getting out there and being exposed to it is one of those things that expose your kids, get them outside, let them help in the garden. There are some studies, there's some research that shows your hands in the soil has some amazing benefits. Some of it's psychological, some of it physical. So get your hands in the soil. It actually can make a big difference in how you look at gardening, can actually make you healthier in the long run. So nice to see that Tony is here. I see some of the conversations going on about potatoes. Give you a little teaser that Tony O'Neill is going to be on the show here in a few weeks. And we're going to be talking about his newsletter and a fantastic video reference tool that he has developed. So we'll be talking more about that. You can look at Tony's most recent video on the Simplified Gardening channel where he talks more about that. So potatoes, I think Tony is going to end up being a world recognized, if he's not already, world recognized expert in growing potatoes. So he's definitely the guy to ask. Dan Galimidi says, big tip, no myth. Be vigilant with checking cucumbers. Just found a hidden cucumber that was 3 times the size it should be. Yes, and so I actually mentioned this in my cucumber video that I did a couple years ago. And no doubt Jay's already searching to find that cucumber video. And I talk about that. That is not a myth at all. What happens with the cucumbers is, and it happens with most plants, but it's so obvious in cucumbers. When the plant puts out its flowers and those flowers turn into fruit, the plant is trying to propagate. It wants offspring. It wants viable seed that can create a new generation. So when you harvest that cucumber, you're taking away the next generation of that cucumber. And so the response of the cucumber is to put on more flowers and to put on more fruit. And it continues to do that. So the way to get the most cucumbers is to harvest continually. Every time you have a cucumber ready to harvest, cut it off and use it. The problem develops, especially with cucumbers that are on the ground. That's why I like to trellis my cucumbers vertically, is all it takes is one cucumber to be hidden underneath a leaf. And once it passes a certain point where it reaches full maturity, the plant says, all right, I've got a next generation developing. And it starts putting a lot of energy into that cucumber that's on the plant. So it gets bigger and bigger. It turns yellow. That's a good indication that that cucumber is harvestable for seeds. If you harvest the seeds of just a regular cucumber, they may or may not be viable. You're probably not going to be anywhere close to 100% viability. The longer a cucumber stays on the plant, especially when it gets to that point that it's big and bulbous and turns yellow, those seeds are perfectly ripe. They're ready to harvest and plant again. And so the plant says, my job is done. And it starts putting out fewer flowers and fewer fruit. So if you're growing cucumbers and midpoint of the season to the late point of the season, you're not getting any more cucumbers, look deep within the plant and you may find that cucumber that's 3 times the size, and it may or may not have already started turning yellow, but that's an indication that the plant may not be producing any more cucumbers. It's considered that it's considered to itself that its life is over and it just wants to rest and die because its job is done, that it has created the seeds for the next lives to follow. Milltown Life, here's a myth. I want confirmed or busted. Digging a square hole to plant a tree. Is this true? So yes, this is another one of those things. So it used to be, and this is the progression of information. And so it used to be that we just dug a hole that looked like the pot. So we had a potted tree. We dug a hole just a little bit bigger than the pot, put in some compost, took the tree out of the pot and plugged it into the round, vertically sided hole. That worked for generations. Then, based on a little bit of research, it became a bowl-shaped hole because most of the roots on trees, and this holds true for all plants, is going to be in the top portion of the soil. And so what was happening was the roots had to fight through the wall of the hole. But if you created a bowl with a gradually tapering side, then the roots could get established more quickly because those topmost roots are now growing laterally farther than a vertical hole would be. And so you have broader development of roots in a bowl-shaped hole, and over time, a more robust root system. Now there's some information out there that is, I think there's still more research to be done. I think it still needs to be tested a little bit more. But the idea is that with the round hole, not necessarily the bowl-shaped hole, but the vertical cylinder hole, that when the roots hit the side, the soil inside the hole is loose. You just dug it out, you just put it back in, it's loose, but the soil outside is compacted. And so where the roots would stay in the hole because you had compost in the hole, the roots will also stay in the hole because they hit the edge and then they just follow the circle. And so you get the circular growth of roots in a cylinder hole. So the next step of this progression is you dig a square hole so that when the roots hit the corner, they got nowhere to go. They can't turn. So the roots are growing through the corners of a square hole because they've got no choice. And that's the way to ensure that all of the roots are not staying inside the hole. I haven't seen any good research-based information yet that says that method is better than the bowl-shaped method. I would tend to think that it might be anecdotally better than just the cylinder hole, but many of us, I haven't dug a cylinder hole in decades. That way I plant trees now, and in my tree planting videos, I talk about the bowl-shaped holes, and that's typically how I do it. And it works. I've got trees that are fruiting. I don't think I need a square hole. Is there anything wrong with doing a square hole? I don't think so. This is one of those tips that I don't see a problem with. It's just, I'm not sure that you need to take the effort to dig a vertical hole or a hole with vertical sides just to get that square shape. I tend to think that maybe the next step in this evolution of tree planting knowledge is to do square shaped bowls So where we get the advantages of the bowls, where the top portion of the soil is loose for those first roots that are developing, instead of doing a round bowl, is do a square-shaped bowl so that any roots that get to that corner have that same benefit of having no other choice but to keep going straight into the corner, into the established natural soil. So I wouldn't say it's a myth for Milltown life. I would just say it is yet to be proven. But I have seen some university-based extension master gardener articles that suggest you should do it that way. Being a master gardener, having gone through the master gardener program, having been an instructor for master gardener classes, and having taught a bunch of community classes as part of the master gardening program, I can tell you that while I thought I was doing the best job at the time, there's been a lot that I've learned since then. And some of the information I gave may not have been the best information 20 years ago when I was doing that. And I see a lot of master gardener articles that really comes down to the opinion of the master gardener without the research-based guidance from the master gardener program. But because they're doing this article or doing a presentation as a master gardener, it tends to have more credence and more validity. That's not always the case. So I would say be careful about that. I did a recent review. Quite a few of the fact sheets I got 20 years ago have been updated with new information. And the information continues to change as new techniques and new testing comes out. And I think the square hole kind of falls into that category where it makes sense. Some preliminary analysis tends to make you think it would work, but we'll just have to wait and see. Until we home gardeners have 3 trees and we plant them 3 different ways and get an idea of what works. So then we do 3 more and then 3 more and then 3 more. That's the problem with home testing, is for it to really give you some valid results. And that was one of the big critiques I got with my tomato plant test. One said that to be valid, I needed to do 36 plants of each method to be able to determine if my findings were accurate or not. Well, I'm not going to grow 108 tomato plants just to see if the way you plant them works or not. And I think how you dig a hole for a tree kind of falls into that category. If what you're doing works, then keep doing it. If you want to try something new, then dig a square hole and see what comes about as a result of it. So let's go ahead, because this is another thing I want to talk about. I mentioned earlier about the ways to control pests from some people is to spray a homemade soap product on it. I think a better way to control pests is to keep the pests away from your plants. So this photo of a garden comes from Peter Hashke. And thank you, Peter, for sharing your garden with me. This is awesome. So Peter's garden, you can see, looks to be primarily raised beds of a few different sizes. There are raised beds that have wooden sides. There are raised beds that have galvanized steel sides. And it looks like there's some lower raised beds of a different product, probably looks like a lower galvanized steel. It might be the same size. It might just be the perspective. But the awesome thing about this garden is all of these beds have hoops, and all the hoops have the fabric over them. The row cover fabric or a specific insect netting over them to keep those pests away from the beds. So if you've got a problem every year with the insects eating your plants, first off, find out what kind of insect it is, and then consider covering your plants with hoops. If it's an insect that comes from outside your garden or outside your beds, now you can keep it away from your plants. If it's an insect that the larva rests in the soil and then emerges from the soil to eat your plants, well, now you're trapping the insects inside the mesh cover. But that may be a way to eradicate the larva because they'll eat your plants and can't get out when they turn into adults. I'm not necessarily advocating that, but that is an option. So, taking the time to put up hoops and taking the time to cover your plants, like is being done here, I think Peter is just demonstrating what I said earlier. A good garden grows where a good gardener goes, and if you're taking the time to take this much effort in your garden, and your garden's going to do great because you obviously will be taking enough time to do all those other things that the plants are going to benefit from. So fantastic to see a gardener making this much effort. And you can see on these galvanized steel beds, there is a wood plate at the tops to sit on. I haven't done that with all of my steel beds. Great idea to be able to sit on the bed and do your weeding and do your harvesting and planting and seeding and everything else you're going to do. I like to rest my back on the beds by having a seat. Always a great option. It looks like in the background there might be a sitting area. And you know me, every week I try to point out a sitting area when I see it, because just getting out in the garden and sitting and enjoying it is also a great way to take care of your plants. I'll sit underneath my gazebo and just look and observe. And every now and then I see something that I hadn't noticed before. A bird, an animal, or maybe the fact that I had planned to put hoops on all my beds and covers and I missed one. I've done that before with some big task garden wide and I missed a space. I do a lot of that recognition by just sitting in the garden or just standing in the garden and observing it. And then you can see the shed. It looks like a shed has been turned into a greenhouse with some clear panels. So we've got greenhouse growing here. We've got the wonderful raised beds. We've got pest control. There's just so much going on that it's just fantastic to see how much effort someone like Peter has taken. And then, of course, fencing around the garden. What kind of pests do you have? If you've got the pests that are roaming, a simple wire fence around the garden that's only 4 feet high is enough to keep most of those pests away. This is a deer-proof garden. Can a deer jump that fence? Absolutely. But deer need to have a good landing spot. They're not going to jump unless they're assured that they can land without breaking a leg. So when you've got a whole bunch of beds behind a low fence, the deer aren't going to jump into that garden. So I'm not sure exactly what the fence is keeping out. I'm ready to put a fence around my vegetable garden to keep Mala out, not because she's a big problem, but there are some times of year where she likes to run through the beds on the way to chase a bird or rabbit or whatever she's chasing. And I just want to try to reduce that impact on my garden, but it's low on my priority list because it takes work. And so think about Peter's garden here, all this effort with the hoops and the fences, it's done. Once you get a big project like this in place, now you can relax and not worry so much about it. And I'm guessing that greenhouse shed doubles as a storage place. So the cool thing about hoops with covers, whether it's plastic or bird netting or the pest control like a row cover or a insect mesh, is cut them to size, which Peter's obviously done here. And then when you don't need them, you just fold them up and put them in your shed, ready for next time. So great example of some options if you want to make that much effort. And thanks again, Peter, for sharing your picture, because I think it is nice for us to look at some of the things you've done and maybe transfer them to our garden. And so Scott Joe is saying, I always have an issue with rabbits and squirrels. Everything has to look like it's in jail. That's true. You know, I've got fencing around all my fruit trees to keep the deer and the rabbits and the voles out, and they do look like jails. with all of the wire fencing I have in my garden. But you know, it works. And at some point, if the plant gets big enough, maybe it won't be susceptible to some of those pests, so you can take down the fencing. But until it gets to that point, yeah, you have to. So let's talk a little bit about rain, since Tony's saying that he's had rain hammering for 10 days. I haven't had rain. I think it's going on 3 weeks, maybe a month. I haven't had any rain. Today, this afternoon, maybe. Tomorrow actually looks likely for me to get rain. So I feel your pain, mate. I'm sorry to hear that you've got so much water coming down. I wish we had some of it in this area, you know, with 100-degree days, 38 Celsius days, and no rain. My plants, they're not struggling because I'm watering them. I've got them under shade cloth, and the soil has got a lot of organic matter, so it retains the water. My plants are doing great, but it's a lot of work to maintain it. Rain's the same thing. Rain's one of those things that it's a lot of work to deal with the problems that rain develops. So if you can develop some mitigating factors at raised beds, and Tony has mentioned this. He does a lot of container growing. And I think it was a recent video I was watching. It was talking about raised beds. One of the advantages to raised beds is the drainage, especially in a rainy environment. Raised beds drain better than the freestanding ground. When the ground gets saturated, it tends to stay saturated because there's nowhere for that water to go. Whereas a raised bed, if it gets saturated, the gravity will at least drop it down to the lower part of the bed. And so it tends to dry out better. So it's the opposite in a dry region. Because it dries out faster, it means I need to water my beds more often, but I'm okay with that. And it allows me to actually individually water all my beds to work. So hope the rain breaks for those of you that have too much rain, and that it starts for those of us that don't have enough rain. Mark Lee is wondering, in 30 years, I have a woodchuck problem. Live trap and baiting has not worked. Suggestions. And so woodchucks, I don't have woodchucks in my area. It's more of a problem in the eastern United States. And there are other countries that have animals that are similar to woodchucks as well. And so the issue with trapping most of the animal pests we have in our garden, maybe this is what you encountered. So there's usually a population of that animal pest. And so you trap an animal like that and another one just moves in. I've had squirrel issues in the past, and that's what happened. Anytime one squirrel died or was eaten, you never even noticed because another squirrel was there to take its place. That is often a reason why live trapping doesn't work. If you know you have an individual woodchuck and you capture that woodchuck, then yeah, the problem goes away. But that rarely is the case. And baiting has minimal effect, and especially if you're baiting with poison. We had two beautiful owls, a male and a female owl that has lived in my neighborhood for years, and they're gone. And my neighbor found their bodies in her yard. And the guess is that people who were baiting the rabbits and the gophers in our area, that poison bait that the rabbits and the gophers ate, now the owls eat that same gopher or rabbit, ingest that poison, and it can kill the owl. So first off, the baiting doesn't work as well either, partly because it's not the right kind of bait, or because the animal learns to stay away from the bait, or if it's a bait that kills the animal, again, another one moves in. I do have some concerns if there are natural predators in the area that you've eliminated the predators, because that's usually a solution that tends to work, not necessarily work to eradication, but works to the point that you no longer have a problem. And that is the predators. See what predators you have in your area, and see if there's something you can do to attract those predators. I told this story months ago. at the garden club Christmas party we were at, and one of the gardeners in my garden club was asking about eradicating foxes. She has foxes on her property and she doesn't want the foxes. Are they posing a problem? Well, no, they're not. I just don't want foxes on my property. And then I asked, do you have a rabbit problem? Well, no, I don't have a rabbit problem, but I want the foxes gone. It's like, did you used to have a rabbit problem? Oh, yeah, I used to have a terrible problem with rabbits, but now the foxes have built a den down by the edge of the road. Well, there's a correlation there. The foxes moved in to eat the rabbits. So she got rid of the rabbit problem. She now thinks she has a fox problem. I don't think a den down by the road necessarily corresponds to a fox problem. I look at it as a security guard station. And when new rabbits appear, the foxes are going to take care of them. Woodchucks kind of fall into that same category. If you have coyotes, if you have foxes, if you have owls, whatever it is that is the natural predator to woodchucks in your area, see if you can do something to make your garden an inviting location for the predator. Then, and it takes time, but then you may see a reduction in the woodchuck problem. Mala and a neighborhood feral cat have pretty much eliminated my gopher problem. I've seen no indication of gophers in my garden this year. Last year I did, the year before it was bad, the year before that it was worse. I saw a cat, before I got Mala, my garden dog, actually come into my garden while I was working. And then about 15 minutes later, I saw that cat carrying a gopher in its mouth over the fence. And Mala has done a great job digging the burrows of the gophers to either intimidate them or to drive them out to another area. And that's when I mentioned that I want to build a fence around my garden for Mala. That's part of the reason, is because she got in that habit of digging some of my in-ground beds to get to the gophers. Now that I don't have a gopher problem, Mala still likes to dig in those beds because I think she still smells and the gophers and still knows that some of those burrows are there. So I want to fence her out because now she's the pest because she was a predator for the gophers. I don't have a gopher problem. The predator problem may or may not be an issue to come, but that's the thing that I've noticed from a natural perspective, Mark, that tends to work best. You can also try to isolate the food source. So if there's a particular plant that the woodchucks are eating, then set up a sacrificial area where you grow those plants specifically for the woodchucks, and then maybe they'll stay out of other areas. That's what I did with the squirrels. I've mentioned this over and over again with the squirrel problem. That's what my brother and sister-in-law do. They have squirrel feeders on their fence, and they keep the squirrel feeders full, and they have zero problem with squirrels in their garden. At my last house where I had a squirrel problem, my neighbors had 10 bird feeders that they had just inside my property because I had some open space near the trees that they didn't have. So I allowed them to put bird feeders in my yard because the squirrels were eating the seed from the bird feeders. Never had a problem with squirrels in my garden. So if you give them an alternative food source that's easier for them, they'll often gravitate towards that food source and leave your primary garden alone. That can be a wonderful way to deal with it. Karen Stratton says, hey, Scott, just to say thank you for the info on Nettle fertilizer. Cool. Yep, smelled like poo, but the garden loves it. So fantastic. Yeah, I was just watering my nettle yesterday and thinking I should probably harvest it and make a tea to put on plants. And so this is one of those things talking about the information that you should or shouldn't follow. There is very little research on homemade fertilizers where we take plants and we soak them in water. And I did a video about this. I resisted doing that video for years because there's no research to support it. You take weeds, you take plants like stinging nettle and dandelion, and you soak them in water. And as those plants decompose, as they're broken down by the anaerobic bacteria, the nutrients in their leaves and stems are released into the water. So the nutrients leach out into the water. Makes perfect sense. You can actually test the water, and there are nutrients in it. And so then you use that water as a fertilizer. The problem I have mostly is you don't know how many nutrients are in that water. You don't know the NPK value. It's just water that has leached plant material in it. Anecdotally, thousands of gardeners do this and notice a difference because between the bacteria and between those leached nutrients, we are putting something back into our soil. It's probably not a lot, but even a little bit can make a difference. As a good gardener, trying to get a good garden, taking the time to make your own fertilizer like that shows that you're taking the time to water your plants. It may just be that water that you're adding to your plants is keeping the soil moist, and that's why your plants are doing great. It may be because that plant was a little deficient in that nutrient, and adding your homemade fertilizer made a difference. I think it's more likely that what you're doing is you're benefiting the soil life. Again, the soil has to consume the nutrients and make them available into the plants. So I think that's what's really working here. When you add a homemade fertilizer to your soil, you're adding food for those microbes. Now that food is available for the plants right there in that liquid that you put into the ground. So this is something I recommend it. I made a video about it. Don't have a lot of research to support it, but it is something I do. It is something that others do. And if it's not doing any harm, then there's really no reason to stop doing it. If it gets you out to your garden, and if you see what you perceive to be a benefit, then keep doing it. And I'll keep doing it for that same reason. Comfrey, I have read not so much research, but some general studies on Comfrey. I did a video years ago about using Comfrey as a fertilizer tea. And one of the things I've learned more and more about Comfrey, I love Comfrey. I've got Comfrey all over the place, but it has a lot of nutrients in the leaves, but the amount of those nutrients in the leaves is not as much as was commonly thought. And so while Comfrey does have a lot of nutrients, by comparison, stinging nettle has more. And so as you choose the plants you're going to use, assuming that that leached water is making a difference, by focusing on some of the plants that actually have more of the beneficial nutrients, maybe that's a better use of your time. If you want to keep doing it the way you're doing it and it's working, go for it. There's just not a lot of research that supports that. There's minimal research, again, but on compost tea. I'm not a big fan of compost tea. It's too much work for me to take a bucket and put a aquarium aerator in it to produce the oxygen bubbles so the aerobic bacteria can turn that compost and water into something that works in my garden. Instead, I'd rather use that compost directly in my soil. Now, the water and the microbes will break that compost down into usable nutrients. The diluted compost that is soaked in water, I don't think adds, and I've seen no research that supports that it is adding nutrition to your plants. And so I think it's wasted effort, even though the put it in a bucket and let it sit and get smelly for a couple of weeks is something I do because it's just so little effort. But there has been some research that shows that the compost tea as an antifungal agent that you spray it on your leaves, that is beneficial. It's not adding enough nutrients and any value to affect the plants if you actually use the tea as a fertilizer. But as a foliar spray, it does have some effect on some diseases, some fungal diseases in particular, and possibly as a foliar spray, the leaves are absorbing some of that nutrients. So no concise, precise, definitive information on that, but it's something you might experiment with as well. And that's one of those things. There are a ton of videos out there on making compost tea. I don't have one because it's not something I do and not something I advocate. But there's a lot of gardeners doing it. A lot of gardeners think it works. And so if you think it works and you like doing it, I've said this before, continue doing that. The whole point today was to get you thinking a little bit more about how you approach gardening, where you get your advice from, and then what you do with that advice once you have it. I love giving advice. I know a lot of gardeners like giving advice. As a gardener seeking advice, I just question a lot of what is told to me until I've done that additional research. Colorado Bird Nerd, always good to see you here. Thank you so much for that. Learned so much again today, as always. Well, thank you. And I am looking forward to you being back. And I appreciate the donation. That's always appreciated. Thank you so much. And so as you move forward and learn more about gardening, I think gardening is all about learning. Just keep learning about gardening every day, and you will become a better gardener. Part of that is judging what it is that you hear, good, bad, for you, and whether you should or shouldn't do it. And then just continue doing that on a regular basis. And eventually you'll figure out your own philosophies, your own methods, your own ways of gardening in your garden. And then feel free to give all the advice you want. And don't feel bad about it because it works for you. Might as well share it with others because it might benefit them as well. Going to go ahead and let you get outside. I need to go outside and do some more watering and tending to my plants. I need to do some tomato pruning on my healthy plants to keep them under control. And let's hope that I get some rain this week. Keep your fingers crossed. I'll be back next week doing this all over again. I hope you all have a fantastic gardening week. And of course, above all, enjoy your gardening. We'll see you then.